Hello all, and welcome to our discussion on climate change, elections, and Indiana's future. My name is Sarah Bowman.
And my name is London Gibson, and we are both environmental reporters at the Indianapolis Star. Our environmental reporting project at the Star over the last 3 years is made possible through the support of the nonprofit Nina Mason Pulliam Charitable Trust.
Whether you're someone who's long followed environmental topics and issues, or you're someone who's new to this and is interested in learning more, we hope that this discussion brings you some new information and a variety of perspectives.
Two recent statewide surveys, one by Indiana University and the other completed by Arizona State University on behalf of the Pulliam Charitable Trust, give an inside look at how Hoosiers feel about the environment and climate change. Some of the findings, which we will ask our guests about, may come as no surprise. Others reveal some potentially interesting takeaways.
The results of this survey of both of these surveys are particularly timely. They come in the context of major environmental events, such as the wildfires raging on the West Coast or flooding across the Midwest that we had last year. They also could give insight into the priority that Hoosiers place on environmental issues and climate change as we head into November's presidential and gubernatorial elections.
Our discussion today will be broken up into 4 segments where we will be asking our guests about climate change, pollution, energy and the economy, and the government. And at the end of each segment, we will also be asking our guests one question based on questions that our readers have submitted to us as part of our Q&A column, which is called the Scrub Hole.
First off, we'll be talking with Jill Hoffman and Jeff Dukes about climate change and its impact on Indiana. Jill is the executive director of the White River Alliance. The Alliance has been a big part of the White River Vision Plan here in Indianapolis to clean up the river and make it a thriving resource. But the group also works a lot on issues at large, including pollution and water supply.
And Jeff is the director of the Climate Change Research Center at Purdue University. That center has issued reports in recent years looking at the main impacts of climate change across Indiana, including on agriculture, water resources, energy, public health, and more.
So hi, Jeff and Jill. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Hi, ladies. And to get started, I will ask this question to both of you. Whoever wants to take it first, it's up to you. What are some of the ways that climate change will be impacting Indiana in the years to come? And what are some of the things that our state should be doing to get ahead of those impacts?
Sure. Well, we've put out a bunch of reports on this, as you said, in the last few years. And if anyone wants to see them, they're available at indianaclimate.org. But some of the main impacts in Indiana are going to be on people's health. They're going to be on agriculture. They're going to be on the infrastructure of the state. So in terms of health, we're going to have a lot more dangerously hot days, we expect. We're going to have probably worse air quality going forward associated with those hot days, more diseases able to thrive in this area, and greater flood risks in many areas, which is going to affect people's mental health and potentially their health as well if they get caught up in that. With agriculture, we're looking at the potential for harder conditions to farm in with wetter springs and more drought stress in the summer because of the hotter days. Also, it could be harder for people to do farm work outside when it's really hot in the middle of summer. And then things like infrastructure and our ecosystems, they're going to be affected in a variety of ways, but our infrastructure is mainly designed for the climate that we used to live in, not the climate that we're going to have. And so we need to be designing our infrastructure for the future, for the warmer conditions, for the wetter, stormier conditions that we're going to have. And we need to be thinking about managing our ecosystems in ways that the species that live in them can move around to stay in a climate that they can tolerate, and to make sure that we have healthy natural populations so that the challenges coming from the shifting climate aren't so big that they really dramatically damage our natural populations, which we know are under threat from many, many other sources as well. So that's a smattering of things. I don't want to take the whole time here, so Jill, over to you.
Well, that's great. I love when the climate expert starts out. Obviously, my perspective is coming at it from the water cycle perspective. And so, Jeff just mentioned a lot larger seasonal swings in that cycle. And so I guess I would just add to that, when you start to think about water supply, those swings are going to be critical to serving our communities at the times when either we have too much water on the landscape or times when we need more water late in the summer. So I think our biggest challenge ahead for that from the water standpoint is just how do we manage that? How do we more comprehensively take a look at what shows up in the spring, figure out how we store, keep, infiltrate that water so that when it's hot and dry later that we have it available for us. The alternative to that is that we have significant impacts to business and people's drinking water supplies and recreation at the very time of the year when we need it the most. So I think when I think about, what kind of changes we are facing and things we need to do to mitigate it, it's more about planning for the whole, not necessarily planning for one-off events or one-off impacts, but how do you manage the water cycle holistically to kind of mitigate the worst of it at those seasonal times?
When we look at agriculture, there are lots of practices that we can take to minimize the impacts on agriculture. And some of the really good ones are things that we're already saying are good practices that should be implemented on the landscape. Things like implementing no-till or reducing the amount of times that we're tilling up the soil. That can help stabilize the soil that might otherwise be lost to erosion from the larger storms that we're expecting to get, and help keep the nutrients in place from the wetter springs and summers that we're expecting to get when there aren't necessarily now in conventional agriculture plants there to take up those nutrients or to stabilize them. But along with that, another technique we can use is cover crops. So planting crops that maybe we're not going to harvest, but they occupy the soil during the months that the cash crops aren't there, that maybe there's no corn or soybean growing on the landscape, but if there's some other plant that's there that can help stabilize the soil and be photosynthesizing and putting more carbon in the soil, making it healthier. That's also binding up the soil, making sure it doesn't erode, making sure the nutrients don't go anywhere. That sort of thing is only going to get more important. And the good news is that actually is also something that takes more carbon out of the atmosphere and stores it in the soil. So that's something that's minimizing the scale of the problem just a little tiny bit, at the same time that it's minimizing the damage from the problem.
And I mean, Indiana and Hoosiers get a bit of a bad reputation, when it comes to the environment or climate change, and maybe not being particularly environmentally conscious. But yet, according to a recent survey that looked at statewide at Hoosiers' opinions on the environment, about 6 in 10 people said they felt climate change was a very serious issue facing the world today. So do you think that reputation that Hoosiers get is legitimate? Do you think that's true? Do you think that's something that's also shifting?
Well, that's a interesting question. I think if you have to go back and you think about how have Hoosiers related to the environment over time. And historically, we often look at our natural resources as commodities, right? We're farming them, we're mining them, we're using them, and that's okay. But if you're going to have that mentality about the natural environment, then you need to value those commodities all the way through their uses. So when Jeff was talking earlier about shifting infrastructure and putting more live plants into the ground and those kinds of things, those functional landscapes need to be valued as high as the landscapes that produce, say, a crop or produce some sort of raw material. So it's, I think when Hoosiers think about the way they relate to the environment, if it has function, then we value it. And so what we have to start to do is apply functional value to some of these other things we get. And then what we'll see is an increased environmental ethic, without a doubt, because once you value something, then you start asking yourself, how do I manage for it in order to protect it? But if we don't value it, then we don't manage for it. So I think that's the kind of shift that we have to make, is can we make sure that we place a value, even if that has to be economic, on some of these ecological functions in the system, And then we will see that our Hoosier values and the way that we relate to the environment lines up quite well with conservation and climate change mitigation.
You know, there are legitimate issues with the problems with the environment here in Indiana, and there's, you know, we are more relaxed on a lot of environmental regulations than many other places, and that has consequences. On the other hand, if you talk to Hoosiers, I think Hoosiers care about the environment. They care about the environment in lots of different ways, and you'll see some of the most passionate people in the country here in Indiana when it comes to environmental issues. You know, you'll also see people who are less passionate, and that's fine. But I think that everybody, pretty much everybody, cares about the environment in some way. It's just how they express that and what they think their priorities are relative to the environment, what they think is important about the environment. And I think that the recent poll has shown that you know, those opinions are shifting a little bit.
For both you, Jeff, and you, Jill, you both touched on this a little bit already, but we've heard from Hoosiers in recent surveys as well that they are noticing some of the impacts of climate change now, today, and in recent years. People have said that they are noticing an increase in rain and flooding, that they are noticing the average temperature rising. What are the impacts that you would say we are already feeling in Indiana, and what are some of the first ones we can expect to see?
It is also getting warmer in Indiana. Now that trend is much weaker than it is in most other parts of the country and many parts of the world. So it would be a little bit hard to actually notice that, although you might think you're noticing it because you hear so much about climate change here. But we've warmed about 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit on average in this state over the last 125 years. So it is a real increase, but it's not a huge one.
When the infrastructure fails, when the farm fields are too soggy to get into in the springtime, you know, that's all drainage infrastructure that's either working right or not working because it wasn't scaled for the kind of volume, and we haven't built landscapes that work on infiltration as a principle typically. So when you treat stormwater like wastewater and find some way to push it into a pipe that has a capacity, then eventually, as those volumes get bigger and those capacities get less, people feel that in different ways. So I think if we asked people, you know, not so much about noticing weather changes, but noticing lifestyle changes or failed infrastructure or challenges related to their vocation, then they would definitely say every day they feel climate change.
And along those lines of impacts, this brings us to our Scrub Hub question to close out the segment here. This being the question that was submitted to us by a reader as part of our Q&A initiative. And Gregory asked, you know, that environmental issues are often presented at the national level. And I know, Jeff, you know, the Purdue Climate Change Research Center has done a lot looking at this at the state and regional level, but he was curious on a local level, you know, how is climate change impacting Indianapolis, you know, as kind of an urban area, and also kind of to what you were speaking a little bit, Jill, is what does this mean in terms of, you know, what can a city do to try and kind of plan for those infrastructure changes and thinking about how do we, you know, build out that capacity?
You know, one of the things that I think people may notice on a day-to-day basis, and it, you know, we're a little while out from noticing this too dramatically, but is that the nicest days of the year will increasingly shift away from summer and towards spring and fall. So right now we have a decent number of pretty nice, you know, temperate days that happen in the summer. We have lots of hot days in the summer too, but increasingly summer is going to get less tolerable, and winter and spring, and winter and spring and fall will get more tolerable, and in the beginning and ends of those seasons. So we may see some of the events that we traditionally have held in the middle of the summer being moved to other times of year because it's just a more pleasant time to be outside on average.
I love questions from viewers that you guys have because they give insight into what matters to people. And I think asking what's going to happen around a place like Indy is really important. You know, we have to start thinking not only about managing like flood risks and what have we built in our floodplains that now will be under pressure in a way it's never been under pressure before, what does that mean? So a lot of those industries that need the river to discharge and need to be in close proximity have put a lot of high risk facilities in those floodplains. So we need to think about how are we going to mitigate those and, move things out or preserve upstream flood space to mitigate that stuff. So I think we're going to see some land use planning in Indianapolis that acknowledges and needs to acknowledge the amount of risks we have sitting in our floodplains. I think that as we're looking ahead, the state's finishing up a big water study on supply and demand in central Indiana and looking at an increased demand here going forward. And then knowing we need to close a gap of 100 million gallons a day or so, we need to manage these supplies a little better and stop treating our water as a wastewater product that we send away, and figure out how do we manage that here locally for those long, hot, dry times that Jeff's talking about. So we are, I think, going to experience a really acute effect of the differences in the water cycle and what that means to our daily lives in Indianapolis pretty strongly. And what I hope it means is that we start to view the water as an asset and come up with strategies that manage it more holistically in our community as the critical piece of how we can exist here safely and grow economically.
Great. Well, Jeff and Jill, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about climate change. We appreciate it.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
Hello, all, and welcome to our discussion on climate change, elections, and Indiana's future. My name is Sarah Bowman.
And my name is London Gibson, and we both are environmental reporters at the Indianapolis Star. During this discussion, we will be asking Jill Hoffman, the Executive Director of the White River Alliance, and Janet McCabe, the Director of the Environmental Resilience Institute at Indiana University, about pollution and its impact on Indiana.
So hi, Jill and Janet. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So Janet, we will start with you. In terms of this topic of pollution, what do you think are the issues facing our air quality here in Indiana today? And how has that changed over the years?
Yeah, well, there certainly are air quality challenges that we face here in Indiana, and they have changed over time. 40, 50 years ago, or maybe even more recently than that, you could see air pollution in Indiana, especially in the more industrial parts of the state, like Northwest Indiana. There were plumes of black smoke, and we still see that occasionally, but a lot less. And that's because most of those types of factories now have pollution control devices on them that capture most of the visible pollution that we see. But there is air pollution that is too small for us to see, and it still can affect our health. And the things we need to worry about the most here in Indiana are fine particles, which are teeny tiny little particles. They're about 1/70th the diameter of a human hair, and you can breathe them deeply into your lungs. You can't see them when they come out of a smokestack, but they're there. They come from factories, they come from power generation, they come from motor vehicles. Those same sorts of sources can also contribute to what's known as ozone pollution or smog.
And Jill, from your background, what are some of the major issues facing pollution in Indiana's waterways that we are seeing today, and how has that changed in recent years?
Yeah, well, I think, what's hard to communicate to folks about water pollution is a lot of what causes us a problem in the water are things that are, just part of our natural system. So I'm talking about, common bacteria that's in the human gut or in the guts of animals, right? So you're talking about E. coli and other pathogens that wash in. So, a lot of people like to think about pollution as like this big pipe with this green oozing stuff. And when we're trying to talk about, hey, it's really about managing our own waste, or it's about managing animals on the landscape, or the nutrients that come in with a lot of the organic matter, right? So those nutrients can cause algal blooms that have toxins associated with them. So some of the challenges about water pollution are getting people to understand that it's everyday sources and very common elements that are causing water problems. Of course, we still have discharges from industry and coal ash ponds and some of the heavy metals and those things that are dangerous as well. But the biggest conversation about water pollution often surrounds these things that are commonplace and therefore seem less threatening, but the numbers and the amount of our waterways, it is a real threat.
And so, I mean, along those lines, and you both kind of touched on some of these things there, and actually in one of the recent surveys, statewide surveys looking at Hoosiers' opinions on environmental topics, 69% of those who responded said that they, believed Indiana's waterways are polluted and need to be cleaned up. Another 3/4 of respondents said they were concerned about emissions from vehicles or coal-fired power plants, as you mentioned, Janet. So, what are some of the things that can and should be done to address those sources of pollution? And Janet, this I think is an opportunity to talk a little bit, like you said, about some of those things that are kind of impacting us here that we kind of feel more acutely.
Yeah, so air pollution can generally be divided into 3 or 4 categories. About a third of the pollution in our country, and that's true here too, come from mobile sources, cars, trucks, buses, that sort of thing. And those pollutants are both widespread. There's a lot of cars in Indianapolis, in a big city like Indianapolis. And so there's a lot of emissions, and they kind of make a regional or a citywide, countywide problem, but they also can make a very localized problem. If you happen to live near a bus barn or a place where there's a lot of truck traffic, you're going to have an increased amount of diesel fumes in your neighborhood. So that's about a third of it. About another third of it is related to power plants. They are big consumers of fossil fuels in the state. We depend on them for almost everything we do anymore, right? Everything requires electricity, so we depend on these. In Indiana, we still burn a significant amount of coal to make that electricity, and coal is pretty much the dirtiest fuel around in terms of both pollutants that affect our immediate air quality and also pollutants that contribute to climate change. And then there's sort of everything else. And that could include gas-powered lawnmowers. It could include evaporative emissions from printing and painting our houses. It can include all kinds of different pollutants that are emitted from different sorts of industrial activities. And of course, Indiana is an industrial state, so we have a lot of those emissions. And I think the things that we need to do to think about this is that we need good, strong laws that harness available technologies and encourage companies, set goals so that companies innovate and find ways to produce the things they want to produce with less pollution burden for the rest of us. We need to be looking at our cars, and there's a strong move towards using more electricity to fuel our mobile source, like the Red Line in Indianapolis, and people going with electric cars. Those kinds of things will really make a big difference in terms of the pollution that we're seeing in the city.
The number of respondents that believe, that our waterways are polluted is the vast majority, because they probably see it or experience it in some way. The discussion that Janet's having about, what do we do about it? You got to really look at where that stuff's coming from. And so, we start looking at our waterways. We have these sort of historic, what I would call acute pollution sources, right? They come in through a pipe. We know there's an industry or something associated with them. But what's changed over time is that the chronic, the more diffuse pollution that kind of belongs to everybody keeps increasing as we increase our population and we increase, our industries, and we grow our state and its economy. That brings more and more challenges, both in terms of, the number of areas that get paved over that then become conduits for that pollution, the amount of lawn chemicals, farm chemicals, those things are evolving every day. And so we see a new and constant onslaught of new pollution sources, but coming in from, thousands of pipes associated with drainage. So it becomes, when you talk about water pollution, it's a bit like death by 10,000 paper cuts. It's not a simple technology fix, right? It's It's changing our development standards about how far we let water travel and what we allow to collect in it before we try to treat it. So it's having policy conversations about regional planning so that we know who and how many pipes are coming in and who's cooperating to reduce the total load to our streams. So some of these are high-level policy discussions. I think oftentimes we talk about pollution as if there's some giant industry responsible for it, and what is really responsible for it is a lot of our own lifestyle choices. So let's demand better development standards and let's lessen our impact around our homes.
And with all of this in mind, what would you say, where should we place addressing issues with pollution when it comes to protecting public health? What is the importance of that there?
Go ahead, Janet. You want to start this one?
Well, I'd be happy to start this one because air pollution is all about public health. Air pollution is one of the most significant health threats in the world. And in the United States, there's just study after study that associates air pollution with exacerbated asthma, cardiac problems, premature mortality, diminished quality of life, loss of school and work time. And those things all can be translated into dollars, of course, in terms of healthcare costs and lost opportunities, and especially if people are dying prematurely. So it's a significant public health issue. And as with so many of our current issues, affects the most vulnerable among us worse. People who already are compromised in terms of their health status, perhaps, who have less access to good health care, who live in more polluted neighborhoods, who don't have access to safe places to recreate outside and breathe fresh air and be around trees and that sort of thing.
The other part I think about that is just, that we have a lot of things in the water that we're not regulating, we're not even testing for. So when we know it might impact us to ingest a number of an unknown quantity of pharmaceuticals, but pharmaceuticals is one of those things that we know exists in our water. It comes out in our wastewater, it comes off our agricultural properties due to what we're giving animals and what's coming out in their waste. We have lots of personal care products on the market that we put on our body, shower off, and that discharge comes out in our waterways, things like bug spray and DEET and, musks and perfumes and all these things. That's all in there. None of that's regulated. And where it's very understudied as to what kinds of those cocktails of chemicals and products and pharmaceuticals do to people's health over long-term exposure. So we know it's there, we've tested it, we know that stuff's in the water supply. We don't know what the impacts are, and it's very underreported even for the most simple pollution sources like E. coli or other bacteria.
And so this brings us to our Scrub Hub question to round out the segment here, being a question that was submitted to us by a reader as part of our Scrub Hub kind of Q&A initiative. And this question is something that you both touched on a little bit in your previous answers, but a reader was wondering, what can the everyday citizen do to address pollution issues?
You want to take this one first, Jill?
Of course, because, I'm a big fan of two things, right? Like we have to solve these problems individually. We have to take some personal responsibility for, like I was saying earlier, kind of how we live around our homes and how much water we use, how we clean up or don't after various kinds of animals that we domesticate, how we, what kind of chemicals we apply in our daily lives to create these landscapes that then filter off into our water supply. So some personal responsibility for those choices and thinking a little bit hard about living lighter in that way. But I think, we started hosting the Indiana Water Summit and things like that because some of these things are policy level discussions that have to change. And so, the other really important thing to do is make sure that your leaders, whether they're local or state level, or they're maybe even your corporate leaders, are aware that you are worried about these things, that you want a healthier future for yourself, for your kids, or for the ecology of the state. You want to, fish our streams and swim in them. If that's a priority for you, you know, much like other policy issues, you have to use your voice, and you have to make sure that our leaders know that those are priority policy topics, and so we can direct action and funding and research in that area. I mean, without that, you know, we can all do our tiny parts, but there are these large looming issues that require cooperation across all users and communities.
I couldn't agree more. I ask people this question all the time. What's the most important thing that somebody can do? And 9 times out of 10, they say vote. Support people who will support the kinds of policies that we need. This is both state level, national, but also local. To borrow a metaphor from my colleague here, it may seem like a drop in the bucket, but when you ride your bike, not only are you doing something that makes you feel good as contributing to reducing air pollution, but other people are seeing you. And so you're setting an example. And if enough of us ride a bike, or if we're able, buy an electric car or carpool or ride the bus, or recycle that soda can, we're all contributing to the solution in many different ways.
Well, Jill and Janet, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us about pollution today. It was great having you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yes, thanks for doing this, you guys. Important conversations to be had.
Hello all, and welcome to our discussion on climate change, elections, and Indiana's future. My name is Sarah Bowman.
And my name is London Gibson, and we are both environmental reporters at the Indianapolis Star. During this discussion, we will be talking about energy and the economy and how it intersects with the environment. Our guests are Jeff Dukes, the director of the Purdue Climate Change Research Center, and Jesse Carbonda, the executive director of the Hoosier Environmental Council. Thank you, Jeff and Jesse, for taking the time to speak with us today. Just to jump right in, what would you say are the most pressing issues in the state when it comes to energy?
Well, I would say fostering the growth of renewables and storage is important. We already know that renewables are often cheaper than the current sources of energy that we're using. And so expanding those rapidly would save us money in many cases, and also clean up the environment, whether it's the climate pollution it causes or the air quality damages it does or other things. And ending support for environmentally damaging fuels like coal. And then also thinking about the upcoming transition away from natural gas. That's longer range stuff.
Jesse, did you want to chime in as well?
Sure, absolutely. You know, I would say that there are 4 things that come to mind to us. First and foremost would actually be expanding the amount of investment we have in energy efficiency. Unfortunately, Indiana ranks 40th in the United States in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of the public policies we have in place. So, and furthermore, we've seen a decline in Indiana's energy competitiveness from 4th most affordable in America to 22nd in America. And so there's a real urgency to significantly increasing investment in energy efficiency. I'd also say a couple of other things very briefly, you know, to underscore what point that Jeff made about energy storage. I think that's crucial, because what I've learned from a number of conversations with lawmakers is they just are worried about what happens when we go to a post-coal environment. And they think, well, gas is going to be unstable, nuclear is very controversial, so how do we meet this gap and keep electricity reliable? And from our vantage point, utility scale energy storage can do that. And NIPSCO, for example, in Northwest Indiana is showing that, where they're going to have about 65% of their electricity coming from utility scale storage and utility scale renewables by the end of the 2020s. But that's a piece that lawmakers really need to be educated on, in understanding that this technology has significantly reduced the costs. I'll round out the top issues by mentioning simply distributed generation and the notion of making sure that we have a comprehensive policy in place to not only help coal miners go into new economic sectors, but also people who've really been hurting from coal pollution over the decades.
And in a recent survey that looks at Hoosiers' opinions on the environment across the state, it was, I think, around 78% of respondents said that they felt protecting the environment should be given priority, even if that means at the risk of slowing economic growth. Do you think that that's an either or, that choosing the environmental protection necessarily harms the economy, or that these things can work together?
It's interesting to answer your question, Sarah. I don't believe it's an either or. I understand why people maybe at the face of it think might be an either or, in that, you retrofit a power plant or a factory, and well, that's going to cost some money. So wouldn't that mean that there would be higher costs that are passed on to consumers? But the fact of the matter is, when we evaluate public policy, we really need to think about benefits and costs. We need to evaluate public policy and say, well, if we do tighten safeguard with respect to some air pollutant, what is the net benefit to society? And there has been a comprehensive study done of the Clean Air Act, which shows that over the first 20 years of the Clean Air Act, from 1970 to 1990, the benefit cost ratio of the Clean Air Act alone was 40-1. And furthermore, when America really acted in decisively improving its environmental policy, as it did in the 70s and then as it did again in the 1990s, it led to America dominating the pollution control sector. 25% of the pollution control sector is dominated by the United States, based on the last research I've looked into.
I think those are great points. The technology that we develop to address environmental problems can stimulate the economy. Also, though, when we work on having a healthy environment here in Indiana, it is something that attracts workers. I mean, nowadays, the young, new people in the workforce want to see that the companies that they're going to and the states that they're going to are addressing environmental challenges, and that there are healthy places to live. And so at a state level, it's good for our economy that way, just in terms of attracting the best workers to work for our companies here.
And a question maybe specifically for you, Jesse. We have spoken before about the fact that the Hoosier Environmental Council really emphasizes clean energy and renewable resources as a bridge between people from multiple political backgrounds. Can you explain why you think that is and why that is a focus for you?
It's a great question, London. And I think that where it's come from, this notion that there's strong bipartisanship around clean energy, is that we've done workshops across the state where we've had conversations with both people who are conservative and people who are more liberal. And the striking thing is how universally excited they are about things like rooftop solar. For a more liberal-minded Hoosier, the first thing that might come to mind is the idea that they can reduce their carbon footprint, and that they can just be better at contributing to improving the environment. If you talk to a conservative, their motivation isn't any less, but it may be motivated or animated by different things. It may be this notion of energy freedom, the idea that they can pull away from getting most of their electricity from the grid, that they can honor God's creation by being better stewards of the planet or the land or the air through installing solar. So it is this area among all the different dimensions of the environment that we feel can garner bipartisan support, which is crucial given the composition of the General Assembly.
And for you, Jeff, we know that you just recently worked on this kind of report at the national level. What are some of, we've talked a little bit about what are some of the, potential benefits, economic benefits, that come from conservation or protecting the environment. What are some of the potential economic losses if we don't address climate change? And also how, should we, how should that transition be approached? And I think this was a little bit of, what you looked at to make sure that that happens in the best way for society and for the economy.
Yeah, well, at a national level, we're seeing a lot of the economic problems that come with climate change right now, and we can expect them to get worse. So we see that the conditions for large wildfires have been made more severe because of climate change, drying out fuels, creating drier conditions. We see storms that can carry more water and that come on top of a higher sea level that are hitting our coasts and causing damages. We expect that these sorts of conditions are only going to continue. And here in the Midwest, we expect that there will be more damages caused by things like really heavy rainfall events, excessively wet springs, and also by dry conditions in the hotter summers. And we expect that that's going to lead to more crop losses. And all of these different events propagate through the financial system in different ways. And these are just some examples of the problems that come with climate change. But for things like wildfires and storms that address or that wreck properties, those are going to change insurance rates. They're going to raise insurance rates for people in these storm-prone and wildfire-prone areas, or limit their ability to get insurance. That in turn is going to affect property values. When property values fall, that's going to affect property tax incomes in municipalities. That's going to affect potentially municipal bondholders, the municipalities' abilities to pay off bonds. So there's lots of ways that you wouldn't necessarily think of that these sorts of issues propagate through the system. Here in the Midwest, it may be through agricultural banks, and if a lot of their customers essentially are not doing well because their yields are way down, then those banks can have problems too. They may not be able to lend as well, and it might be harder to get out of the hole that is caused by the drought or the flood to begin with.
And this brings us to our Scrub Hub question. And the Scrub Hub is our initiative where we take reader questions and then answer them in short stories or in video format. So for both of you, a lot of citizens want to know what they can do to address this. What are some of the options that exist for alternative energy? And are there any barriers to obtaining those?
Well, I think that Jesse's answer earlier is actually great on this front in terms of efficiency. That's maybe not thought of as alternative energy, but people can buy more efficient appliances. They can do things like insulating their house. There are a lot of relatively inexpensive things that people can do up front that end up saving a lot of money later. That they're not exactly alternative energy, but they'll reduce their energy bills. And be pretty easy to implement and make a difference. Then on the other hand, there are things that are more expensive, like putting solar panels on your house or buying an electric car, which is maybe not alternative energy, but it's switching your energy use potentially towards alternative energy. These things are more expensive up front, so I'd hesitate to recommend them to anyone just as a blanket way, because it really depends on your own situation. Some people won't be able to do that, and they may not pay off very quickly. So it really depends on people's circumstances.
I think Jeff hit on some excellent points about energy efficiency. And I guess one other thing that might not be as cool sounding as rooftop solar or just retrofitting your home is energy conservation. And so, it is, of course, the lowest hanging fruit. It's free, and it's something that people can do to immediately get impacts on, advancing alternative energy, right? The best alternative energy is often said to be a negawatt, never using energy to begin with. And so you can do that by shading those windows that you're not working in or studying in or sleeping in, or it could mean throwing in a dry towel into your dryer, and that improves the efficiency of the dryer. It could be unplugging any appliance or electronics that you may not be using at a given time. So I think that's an important thing that people can enact in the here and now. And I think what a great learning tool this would be for parents or people who look after children, to teach them about energy conservation when so many of us are all together, in the continuing pandemic. The other thing I'd mention, as Jeff said about, is rooftop solar. And to just underscore that the federal and state policy climate for both are going to change pretty significantly. There is a phase out underway at the federal level with respect to a tax credit on installing rooftop solar. It's going to step down in 2021, and it's going to step down again in 2022, and then it's going to be gone for residential customers. And then at the state level, in July of 2022, net metering, which is really the most important incentive that the state has historically had since 2004, is going to be completely gone, despite a tremendous effort on the part of a number of advocates to try to protect that law. That's going to be completely phased out. And the basic concept there is that if you're generating part of your electricity from solar on your home or your business, your place of worship, or etc., any excess power gets fed back to the grid, and you get credited for that power. But after July 1st, 2022, that credit could go down from 11 to 15 cents a kilowatt hour to 3 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's going to make solar a lot less affordable for middle class homes that might have entertained going solar.
Well, Jeff and Jesse, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today about energy and the economy. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Hello all, and welcome to our discussion on climate change, elections, and Indiana's future. My name is Sarah Bowman.
And my name is London Gibson, and we are both environmental reporters at the Indianapolis Star. During this discussion, we will be talking to Janet McCabe, the director of the Environmental Resilience Institute at Indiana University, and Jesse Carbonda, executive director of the Hoosier Environmental Council, about the intersection between politics and the environment in Indiana.
Thank you, Janet and Jesse, both for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thanks for having us.
So to start this discussion, kind of about the role of government, or especially as we have an upcoming election here, both at the state and national level, we're looking at some surveys that were recently put out, looking at opinions of Hoosiers across Indiana. A survey, one both at Indiana University with you, Janet, as well as one that was completed by the Pulliam, the Nina Mason Pulliam Charitable Trust, asking people their thoughts on climate change and environmental topics. And in those surveys, 66% of Hoosiers felt that climate change is one of the most serious problems facing the world today. And the study from IU showed that 72% of Hoosiers believe that they themselves will feel the impacts of climate change in their lifetime. So just, those are just a couple stats from those surveys. But my question is, what do you think of surveys like the Pulliam survey and the IU survey and their importance, especially as we lead into an election?
I think surveys are incredibly useful tools. And one of the reasons that we decided to do one at IU as part of the Environmental Resilience Institute work, it's called the Hoosier Life Survey, is because a lot of the surveying that's done is done at a national or regional level, and it doesn't actually talk to actual Hoosiers. These two surveys that you mentioned talk to actual Hoosiers to get their input. And so you get a sense of where Hoosiers are on these issues, and some of the results are not necessarily what people would expect. A majority of Hoosiers do understand that the climate is changing, and they do understand that that has significant adverse implications for our economy, for our health, for our way of life here in Indiana. And lots of Hoosiers actually support policies that would address some of these issues. So I think this information is super useful.
And to ask you both, this election, the people have a lot of major issues on their mind. And I am talking about the wildfires on the West Coast, but also the COVID-19 pandemic and the public outcry for racial justice that we have seen across the country this year. How do you think that these major issues can tie to environmental issues this November?
Well, there are clearly a lot of issues on everybody's mind right now, and it seems like more every day. And things sort of go up and down in terms of how immediate they are in people's viewpoint. COVID clearly is a big, big, big issue for everybody. The polarization, the Black Lives Matter issues that people are talking about, those have just increased in real immediacy to people. But I think what we're seeing from the polling and also from news coverage and other things is that the environment is a steady and increasing issue of concern. I don't think we're going to see it as one of the top couple of issues this election, but there are an awful lot of people who care about it. And we just heard news that environment is not going to be a question in the first presidential debate. I'm sure it will be a question in the second or third. And just as another anecdote, recently the IUPUI Public Policy Institute held a governor's candidate forum, and I noticed that in the coverage of a certain daily newspaper in a large metropolitan area in Indiana, I don't think the environment was mentioned as one of the issues that was a key one that was talked about. But that doesn't mean that people don't care about it. People do care about it, as it was revealed in these polling results.
I would say that it is remarkable about the tie-in between COVID and the environment, and COVID and racial justice, and environment and racial justice. They're all intertwined in ways that maybe at the surface may not be apparent. I'll give a very concrete example in the Indiana context. Hoosier Environmental Council does a lot of work in regarding coal ash and trying to protect people from the air and water impacts of coal ash. And we were particularly working in Michigan City, where there were some major decisions that were going to be made by IDEM, the state environmental agency, with respect to that coal ash dump there. And there was a proposal to truck that coal ash from the coal ash dump in Michigan City to another location. The process of doing so would have led to a lot of particulates going into the air. And thanks to HEC and several of our local partners, we got IDEM to change its position on that. And this is very much tied to the pandemic issue, because the worry was that people in the vicinity of Michigan City are already particularly vulnerable to COVID. It's a large African-American population there. About 50% of the people who live in the vicinity of this Michigan coal ash dump are African-American, and African-Americans have had much higher rates of COVID cases than whites on a per capita basis. And so there you see that very concrete intertwining of the environment and racial issues and COVID.
And to go back to the surveys and some of the information that came out of the answers that were there, the findings, according to the survey, one of the surveys, 7 in 10 Indiana voters think that both the federal and the state government need to do more to combat climate change. What are your thoughts on those findings in general? But especially, do you think, based on those results and then sometimes what we see elected officials doing, do you think that there's a disconnect there between kind of the way that their constituents feel and then some of the policy decisions that they make?
So if it's a Republican district, the more ideological minded Republican will much more likely be elected, because they'll win in the primary versus the more moderate, pragmatic lawmaker. And this is research that Stanford University has looked into, more ideological minded voters are more likely to go out to primary elections than more pragmatic voters. And so you'll have a composition of the General Assembly that is much more ideological minded than the population at large. I'll mention one other thing, which is about campaign finance laws. Our laws are fairly weak. There are no limits on what a person can give to a candidate for state representative, state senator, or a governor. And so what that can mean is undue influence on the part of particularly large special interests in shaping public policy behind the scenes without most people bothering to look, of course, not having the time to look at campaign finance reports. So that is another mechanism for that disconnect between the sentiment of the public and action in the legislature.
I fully support the excellent points that Jesse's made there. I also want to point out that as people have more personal experiences that derive from either a direct climate change impact, i.e. they have a flood in their own community, or they're affected by climate change in some way, or lawmakers themselves start to know people who are having these experiences, that will influence this as well. But that's a slow way to convince people to listen to what's going on in their communities and make changes in the way they're doing public policy.
And as you both have, kind of touched on throughout some of your answers, is the importance of letting your lawmaker know that these issues are important to you, or voting in a way for a lawmaker that reflects the policies that you want to see in place. Do you think, obviously, when people vote, there are a lot of factors that they're thinking about, but do you think we're getting to a point potentially where people are going to be voting for a candidate largely based on environmental issues and concerns and climate change and what that candidate is doing or not doing to address it?
I think we're reaching that point, Sarah. I think it's striking that PBS NewsHour did a poll that showed, at least at a national level, that among Democrats, the #1 issue on their minds is climate change. That was striking in the midst of the pandemic, in the midst of such a tough economy. So I think polling, whether it's the IU poll or the Morrison poll, is showing that there is, again, strong levels of commitment and care for the environment. The fact that the environment is considered a top 5 issue, a most important issue in Indiana. In fact, I think it's in the top 2 or top 3 in one of the polls. Well, I think that the polling shows that the encouragement that these can be issues that these issues are rising to a higher level of concern on the part of Hoosiers. The fact that the environment is considered a top 4 issue of importance in Indiana. The other thing that I think gives me hope that we will have this phenomenon of the environmental voter or the climate voter in Indiana goes back to a point that Janet raised, which is the imprints of climate change are going to be more and more apparent in Indiana. Back in 2012, 92 counties in Indiana were under a drought emergency. That's the first time, to my knowledge, that had ever happened. In 2018, we had historic floods. So as these manifestations of extreme weather happen in Indiana, which the models from Purdue Climate Change Research Center are showing, we will certainly see more people who will be putting environment front and center.
I think that's true. I think we will continue to have voters who are just motivated by one issue only, whether it's what judges are appointed to the federal courts or personal freedom issues or whatever. We just will always have those kinds of voters in the United States. And that, that's part of what characterizes the culture and tradition of the United States, right, is independence and people's freedom to make their own choices. But I do think that environment is moving up, and I think that it is it's not a separate issue so much. I know that when people talk about these issues, they tend to put them in categories, right? But climate change is about the economy. So if you care about the economy, you should care that we do some things to make sure that climate change does not adversely impact us more than it needs to. And so I think people are understanding that more and more and more.
And that brings us to our Scrub Hub question. And the Scrub Hub is our initiative where we take reader questions and then answer them. We have had several readers reach out to us with questions about the Indianapolis government and its role in climate change. What role do you think that local governments play in sustainability initiatives?
Well, I think local governments have a strong role to play, but they can't do this on their own, right? So Indianapolis worked through an extensive process and adopted its Thrive plan, which has just a whole bunch of different concrete actions. Some of them actually involve concrete, but many don't, to improve efficiency around the city, to reduce emissions around the city, to pay attention to equity in making those decisions. And there are lots of things that cities can do because they control lots of things. They build roads, they run public transit, they heat and cool buildings. They can make choices about whether they're going to use electric vehicles, whether they're going to do energy efficiency projects, and how they are going to encourage neighborhood groups and community partners and local businesses and faith groups and all to act similarly. So there's a very strong role for local governments to play there, and they need to have the ability to move forward and do those projects, but they cannot do it alone. So there has to be state level policy. There has to be federal policy that helps do the things that have to be done at a higher level to then make it possible for local governments to be successful.
Yeah, I completely agree with Janet's perspective there, and I would just supplement that by kind of spotlighting Indianapolis for a little bit longer, which is, it's amazing how many tools Indianapolis has in place to try to tackle climate issues locally. With respect to air, we anticipate as temperature rises that ozone pollution will become an increasing problem in Indianapolis, and there's an ozone program that Indianapolis has that ought to be deployed to particularly lower income communities of color that have borne the brunt of pollution over the years and environmental injustice issues. And so that's one thing the city can do. A second, with respect to water, I know our good friend Jill Hoffman from White River Alliance has talked a lot about stormwater issues, and there it could be about tightening the zoning, or I should say, improving incentives for green infrastructure in Indianapolis through the zoning code. And then with respect to land, being much more proactive in making sure that open spaces are indeed protected in Indianapolis and Marion County, which will help to preserve long-term carbon sinks for our city. It's so critical to also note, as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about and working in the legislature, that we also appreciate the fact that, and this also ties into a point Janet raised, that state government can either empower locals to do good, sustainable things, as it did in 2014 when we passed transit legislation, or it can weaken the authority of local government, as happened with respect to banning the ability to ban plastic bags on the part of cities, or as it happened with respect to stormwater control over a few different sessions. So it's really important that viewers are vigilant in observing how the state government interacts with cities. Cities can have amazing plans. Those plans could be undermined or empowered by the state government.
Well, Jesse and Janet, we really appreciate you two taking the time to speak with us today about the role of government in tackling environmental issues. Thank you both so much.
Thank you for the invitation.
It was a pleasure and a really important conversation. Thank you for hosting it.
Really appreciate it.
We again want to thank all of our panelists for taking the time to speak with us today on these very important topics and issues.
This has been a great conversation, but we don't want it to stop here. We have a Facebook page called The Scrub that you can join if you haven't already, where there's an open dialogue on these topics. We also recently launched an initiative called the Scrub Hub, which is a Q&A type column where we take the questions that you want to know and try to get you answers. So if you have a question that wasn't answered today, please let us know.
And do stay tuned as well, because we have more coverage coming for you as the election approaches, breaking down candidates' positions on the environment at both the state and national level. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.